All right, so this is VAUS SOL2, European Colonization. I'm Mr. Pierce.
I'm Mr. Anderson.
All right, we're going to take a look here. So, we're talking about Europeans coming to America.
Wasn't there a movie in the 1980s called Coming to
I
America?
believe it was. I believe it starred
Eddie Murphy and
Murphy.
Arsenio Hall.
Eddie Murphy and Arsenio Hall. This is a much less happy story than that movie. All right. So, before we get into all this, it's worth mentioning that prior to European arrival, there's, estimated, somewhere around 50 to 100 million Native Americans living in what Europeans are going to call the New World. All right, and 95% of those folks are going to be wiped out. We'll talk about it as we go through. But European arrival is not good for everybody, and it's for many peoples that are indigenous to North America, Latin America, and the Caribbean. It's the apocalypse. It's the end of the world. All right. So Europeans had a variety of reasons for coming to America. When we talk about migration, we talk about push factors and pull factors. Push factors are a reason people leave a place. Pull factors are a reason people. So, like a push factor would be like, there's no land, diseases, no land, warfare, religious warfare, conflict. Reasons to leave Europe, reasons to come to America, opportunity,
jobs,
freedom. So these push and pull factors are always causing people to get up. It's a misconception that people have that migration is normal. Most people in the world don't migrate. Imagine picking up everything you own and leaving and going to a strange land that you've never been to. It's very risky. And so people that migrate, especially international migrants, tend to be the risk takers. Right, so it's a big risk to pick
the risk takers are the people who have no other options.
They have no other options, so they're going to go. But even when you look at like the later on we'll talk about the potato famine. Most people chose to just stick it out and stay in Ireland. But there were folks that were bold that said, we're going to go and we're going to try our luck somewhere else.
1.6 million of the Irish decided to stay there for permanently.
Yeah, they died. Yeah. All right, so people are looking for a couple of things in the New World. Some of them are looking for religious freedom, like the Puritans up here in New England. All right.
Now, when we say religious freedom, we're using that term very loosely because the Puritans were not into religious freedom.
Yes.
When you went with the Puritans, you were a Puritan or you were not
out.
welcome.
You were a dissenter. The Puritans were called the Puritans because they wanted to, and we'll get into them later, but they wanted to purify the Anglican Church of Catholic rituals. They were not terribly popular people in Europe. They believed in predestination. So basically, when you were born, you were either on the heaven list or the hell list, and you really couldn't know.
Well, the reason why we get the Puritans up here in Massachusetts is because King Charles I. Charles I wanted to get rid of the Puritans because they were causing trouble in England. So he was like, go to the New World. Start your own colony.
Right.
He gave them permission. That's when you get this great migration of about 30,000 Puritans that come to Massachusetts.
So they're looking for the freedom to practice their religion, but they are not going to afford religious freedom to anybody else. They were very intolerant. We'll get more into that later. People are also looking for economic opportunity.
Well, we also got the middle colonies.
Oh, yeah, you've got...
In the middle colonies, you got the Huguenots coming in from France. You have Jewish settling
people,
in New York.
Presbyterians.
You got in Pennsylvania. You got your
Quakers in Pennsylvania. The middle colonies are actually very diverse in religion, and we'll take a closer look at those. You have lots of different religious groups in the middle colonies. In the southern colonies, people are really looking for land. Land is economic opportunity. People came to Virginia originally hoping to find gold. Not a whole lot of gold here, but they did find profit in the soil. And they're going to grow tobacco and make a lot of profit off of that cash crop. So religious freedom and economic opportunity, more so religious freedom in New England, religious freedom in the middle colonies, economic opportunity and religious freedom in the middle colonies, economic opportunity in the South. All right. Let's take a look at the New England colonies. So like we said, they're settled by Puritans. They're persecuted in Europe. Like I said, they wanted to purify the Anglican Church of Catholic ritual. They believed in predestination. They just believed you had to just live your best life. And hopefully, if you were really thrifty and hardworking, that would be some indicator that you were destined to go to heaven. But things happen, right? And so the Puritan existence was a little bit of a bleak one. They were also really, really intolerant. And I'll go ahead and put some of these things up. So they were intolerant. They did not like anybody that didn't see things their way. And so one very particular, some people that came to the New England colonies were not Puritans themselves and sort of chafed under this strict puritanical codes. And so some, like Roger Williams, said, I'm getting the heck out of here. And he goes and founds Rhode Island.
Providence.
Because he was a dissenter in the They were intolerant of a lot of things. And in fact, like you couldn't even have, the buttons. Your buttons couldn't be too shiny. The buckles on your shoes couldn't be too flashy. You couldn't have too many. They had these shirts that had sort of slashes in the shirts. That was the style of the day, right? You could only have like one slash. If you had more than one slash, that was just
And I'm definitely a 2-slash
that
guy.
that was just too showy. So they were very strict. They lived in a covenant community, religious community in Puritan New England. Really, in a lot of places in the world, the church was heavily involved in the government.
Well, Winthrop's the one that said that he wanted Massachusetts to be a city on a hill.
Right.
Now, when you have a city on the hill, what are you doing? You're looking up at them as a model. And they also come up with the Mayflower Compact. Mayflower Compact, some people say it, is one of the first forms of government that was set specifically for the New World.
What happened was these guys were not headed for New England. They were headed for Northern Virginia, which was the king's colony. So they were going to live in Virginia and exercise religious freedom, but they were going to be under the authority of the king. Well, they got blown off course, and they ended up in New England. And then a crazy thing happened. They said, hey, we're no longer in the king's colony, so we are going to govern ourselves, which is radical thinking for the time. They're like, we're not going to live under the king. We're going to create our own government. And so they outlined the rules for that government in the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact was a contract to basically live by the rules that sort of govern this covenant community. All right, they were intolerant. They practiced a form of direct democracy.
Now, they did this by the government. The government was not based on a large, overbearing government. It was based on small local government. And in local government, you'd vote. So everyone, now not everyone, the men that owned land could come in and they could participate in a vote. So everyone had an equal vote in this community. So it was a form of a direct democracy, town hall meetings. And we talked about this in World History 1 when we talked about Greece and Athens being the first direct democracy.
Direct democracy originated in ancient Athens. For example, once a year, Athens, everybody that could vote would get together and they would all vote for one guy. And this one guy was not getting voted into an office. It was called an ostracism. Basically, the Athenians would say, hey, let's all vote for one dude, and that guy has to leave Athens and he can't come back. So they would literally vote somebody out of Athens.
They did that to Themistocles, the great Navy general.
And they called it an ostracism because there were these shells called ostraca, and so you would come through and you would write the person's name on this ostraca and you would vote for this person to leave Athens and not come back. Funny thing, they look at these ostraca and they see that, the same person's name shows up a lot of times in the same writing on those ostraca. So if you have kind of an optimistic view, you could say, well, maybe that guy was writing for other people. But obviously, you could also come to the conclusion that somebody was like, I don't like Bob, so I'm going to write Bob's name on as many ostraca as I can and vote Bob out of Athens. All right, so maybe there was some voter fraud back then. Direct democracy, remember, there's no middleman. Do we live in a direct democracy today, Mr. Andrews?
No, sir. We live in a republic which follows the Romans.
Right. We have a representative democracy, so we vote for people who then represent us and vote on various laws and things, because it would be really hard to have a direct democracy in a nation of 300 million people. You'd have to text your vote to 1, 2, 3, 4. It just wouldn't work.
I got a flip phone, which would be
and direct democracy, there's some challenges to it, because in a direct democracy, if you are not in the majority, then your rights can be kind of trampled on. So imagine if, and you can always, at some point, no matter what, you might be black, you might be Latino, or you might, fall into a specific category. You might be of a certain religion.
Or a woman.
You might be a woman. You might be, there are all sorts of different times when we find ourselves in the minority in our society. And still, in our society, we protect the rights of people who may be in the minority. And so direct democracy is not always the best type of democracy, because it can trample the rights of
now, Mr. Pierce, in this town hall meetings, in these direct democracy, did everyone have equal voice?
No, definitely not.
Who had the most voice?
The men, the wealthy men.
And the ministers.
And the ministers.
The ministers could manipulate how laws were going to be interpreted, because they were the guys that had their hands on the Bible.
Exactly. I'm going to pause this real quick and get a pound. All right. In the middle colonies, you've got when we look at New England, it's very rigid. Okay, when we look at the southern colonies, it's a very rigid social structure. So in New England, you've got the ministers and everybody else, and Puritan religion and is the only way. In the southern colonies, you've got the planters and everybody else. A lot of them are Anglican. The middle colonies are always kind of a mix, a blend. The economy is very mixed. The religions, there's a mixture of religions, there's different people. So when you think of the middle colonies, think of a mix, of a flexible kind of structure.
And the two largest cities were also in the middle colonies, Philadelphia and New York. So it's also kind of the trading hub of the colony.
Major commercial centers. There are natural deep water ports there, places where it's very easy to pull a ship up and offload and unload cargo. So those two cities, New York, Philadelphia, become major trade hubs. So you got English, Dutch, and German-speaking immigrants settling in the middle colonies. They're looking for both religious freedom and economic opportunity.
And that's why they call them the Pennsylvania Dutch.
Pennsylvania Dutch.
Because they were German and they spoke the Deutsch language.
The Deutsch language, which is German.
Deutschland über alles.
All right. In the southern colonies, people are mainly coming for economic opportunity. The southern colonies are just silly with gold, right? There's gold in the hills across Virginia, not so much. So they came here looking for gold. They eventually do find wealth, but it's in the form of soil.
Tobacco.
In the Tidewater region, tobacco. So not all early Virginia settlers are called Cavaliers, but Cavaliers are a group of early English settlers. A lot of these guys are wealthy English nobles. A lot of them are second sons who couldn't inherit who couldn't inherit lots of land in England.
And so they
got big land grants from the king. The king gave them lots of land here. Why would the king give away land? It's not doing him any good. The king's not going to farm it, but if he gives it to these nobles, they'll grow tobacco, indigo, and rice on it, and then they'll make money for the king. Lots of poor immigrants also come here, many as indentured servants, which we'll talk about later, or right here. What is an indentured servant, Mr. Andrew?
An indentured servant is that you have people in England. Remember, at this time period, we're having population growth going on in Europe. And what's happening is that the cities are becoming overcrowded. And when there's more people than there are jobs, what happens to your crime rate?
Right.
It goes through the roof. So now you're getting people put in prison, for all kinds of crimes. And to fix this problem, these people can't afford. It's not cheap to sail from England all the way to the New World.
It'd be like you and me trying to book passage to the moon.
Yeah, it's expensive.
Yeah, we wouldn't be able to afford it.
So what happens is you have rich landowners, some of these Cavaliers, guys like King Carter, who was across the creek. He needs people working his fields. So what he does is he'll sign an agreement with these people. I will pay for your passage to this new world, but you're going to have to work for me for 7 years. When that 7 years up, you'll get land. Usually that land's not going to be in the Tidewater. That land's going to be given to him is going to be where? out in the Piedmont.
Right, exactly.
And what happens is these people, these indentured servants, work for 7 years. Now the problem is that they work like dogs, and a lot of them run away. A lot of them die, and they never fulfill their contracts. So, and another thing with an indentured servant is if you do live 7 years, what does King Carter now have to do?
Got to take care of you.
And he also has to get more servants.
More servants. So they're going to gradually get away from the indenture system and toward chattel slavery. More on that later. All right, but many of these folks are going to settle out in the western part of the state. That's going to end up creating some conflict with the Native Americans and some issues down the road. All right. So now, Mr. Anderson, if I said that Jamestown was established in 1607, that might lead you to think that what?
It was successful and a thriving community.
Right, like when you say something's established, you would think it's permanent. But Jamestown was established in the sense that there were 500 people there, and then in the winter of 1609, about 450 of them died. Some of them ate each other.
They called it the starving time.
Yes, the starving time. So if virtually everybody dies, and the few survivors live by eating the dead, I would use the term established loosely. We'll take a look at, and why did Jamestown struggle so much? Look at, go ahead.
I was going to say, Jamestown struggled because you got to remember, this is a business venture.
Right.
These people aren't moving here because, Virginia's so wonderful. I love malaria. That's not why they're coming here. They're coming here to make money quick. They saw the Spanish made money quick. Cortez. We saw what happened with Pizarro. All these Spaniards come in and they steal the natural resources, and then they go back home and they're set for the rest of their lives. So these guys come to the New World and they're not looking to make food. They're trying to find gold. They're trying to find wealth. Meanwhile, are they preparing for the winter?
Take a look at this. Is just a little clip from the manifest, and you can go down. This is the ship's manifest. And it's all the names and the titles of the people that were brought on this Jamestown expedition, this business venture, the Virginia Company of London. Look, you've got Henry Adling, gentleman. Jeremy Allicott, gentleman. Gabriel Archer, gentleman. Look, he died in 1609. You've got John Asby and Benjamin B. Gentlemen. Right? And when you go down the list, what you see a lot of are gentlemen. Well, what kind of work does a gentleman do?
Not manual labor.
These guys are like straight up like Downton Abbey, tea on the lawn at noon types. They're used to people doing work for them. In their mind, they're going to come here, they're going to make a lot of money, and somebody else is going to do the heavy lifting. And they really didn't bring a lot of, useful people. So occasionally you'll see there'll be a boy or maybe a blacksmith, an occasional soldier or a laborer, but there were they even brought perfume makers. They brought jewelry makers. You're going to go to a strange, potentially hostile land. Who are you going to take with you? Definitely a perfume maker.
Yeah, smell good.
That's what I want, trying to cling to survival on the edge of the wilderness.
And it's funny because if you trace these families back, none of these families are going to be the first families of Virginia.
Because they died.
Because they all died.
Right.
The first families of Virginia are going to come in the 1640s, 1630s.
Eventually things are going to change and they're going to say, hey, everybody's got to pull their weight or you don't eat.
That's John Smith's famous.
And so that's going to help Jamestown finally become established. But saying it was established in 1607 is somewhat misleading. They're going to establish a different type of democracy in Jamestown and in the southern colonies. They're going to use representative democracy in the Virginia House of Burgesses. So Burgess is a representative.
And it starts in 1619, right. The House of Burgesses.
1619.
It reaches its pinnacle in power in the 1640s.
Now, who were the Burgesses?
The Burgesses were people that owned land.
Right.
And the more land you owned, the more vote counted. The more points your vote counted.
So don't get it twisted. Don't think that, this was a very democratic place. Because you had to be a wealthy landowner, and actually a wealthy white landowner, and in order to participate in government in the New World. So today, the representative legislature that is in Virginia, our state legislature. Now, when I say legislature, a legislature is it's a group of lawmakers, like Congress or like the Virginia General Assembly. So Congress, which is the Senate and the House of Representatives, is our national legislature. The Virginia General Assembly has a House of Delegates and a state Senate, and that is our state legislature, our state lawmaking body. Here's those gentlemen again. Interactions between groups in the colonies. All right, so during this period, you've got Europeans, you have Africans, and you have Native Americans who are all going to interact in ways they never had before. They're going to exchange culture. They're going to intermarry. They're going to influence each other in tremendous ways, and they're going to create entirely new cultures and traditions in this new land. So even though these are European colonies, they're going to be distinct from Europe in a lot of ways. All right, let's take a look. So the Spanish and the English are going to have violent confrontations with Native Americans. And this is best exemplified. And you usually, when you think of European arrival, you think of Columbus. The first thing Columbus does when he shows up is enslave the Taínos, the Arawak people that he met in the Bahamas, and he wipes them out. He'd tell them that they had to go gather gold for him, and if they didn't gather enough gold, he'd cut their hands off. Eventually, Columbus is arrested and taken back to Spain in shackles. He's really a monster. He's a horrible human being, right? That is really going to set the tone for interactions between the English and the Spanish and Native Americans. They fight with them. They give them smallpox-infected blankets. They try to wipe them out and push them off their land.
And it's also a different perspective. When you talk about the Spanish are moving in and take advantage of the land. The English are coming to Jamestown, and we're going to learn that they make money off of tobacco.
Right.
And with tobacco, the more land you have, the more tobacco you're going to grow. Okay? So land is associated with your wealth. Well, this is land that's already occupied by the Native Americans. So you can see the Native Americans and the Indians are going to be bumping heads.
Right.
Now, the next one I imagine is going to say the French.
Right.
Now, the French, on the other hand, they were trying to base their economy on trade.
Right.
And who knows where most of the furs are at, the beavers. The Indians do. So you're going to befriend the Indians. You're going to want the Indians to show you where the beaver, the best beaver pelts are. So they're going to have a better working relationship. The Indian and the French are.
Those pelts were extremely valuable in Europe. And so trapping became a lucrative business, and the French cooperated closely with Native Americans, intermarried with them. So did the English and the Spanish now. They intermarried too. But when we talk about these relationships, it's important to remember that the English and Spanish, when it comes to their relationship with Native Americans, think conflict. And when it comes to the French and their relationship with Native Americans, think cooperation. Conflict, cooperation. All right. So French exploration, they cooperated. They built relationships. Also, you don't have the French coming in the same numbers that the English and Spanish came in.
Because the French know they're going to make money off of furs,
right.
And you can't have 300 million people come over looking for furs, or what's going to happen to the fur market.
Exactly. So it's a different type of dynamic when it comes to just the French.
One more point is that you got to remember the French are not settling, below the Mason-Dixon line. They're settling in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And you're talking about people coming over from France. Canada has about 2 months of summer, and then you're into fall and winter.
Yeah.
So it's a harsh climate.
It's a little chilly.
You're talking about people that are moving into a harsh climate.
Yeah. All right. So the West African slave trade starts in the Caribbean, in the Sugar Islands, and is established there. They basically wiped out the indigenous people. The natives that lived in those islands were gone. The diseases that they encountered, namely smallpox, they had no immunity to. So they were wiped out, and those that survived were killed either through harsh labor or they were just straight out murdered by the Spanish and English, right? So the Europeans start to import people mainly from West Africa to those sugar islands, right? And so all throughout the 1500s, you have a plantation system to grow sugar in the Caribbean. that is driven by slave labor. And so when they start to tobacco and rice and indigo plantations in British North America, they say, well, hey, this indenture system isn't meeting the demand for labor. Indentured servants are also a little bit dangerous because they have rights. They don't have many rights, but they have rights, and eventually they're free. Let's give them a little bit of land and satisfy them, and then let's just use enslaved African people as the labor source. And so that's what they do. And this becomes the primary source of labor. The first slaves arrived on a Portuguese ship, or they were captured off of a Portuguese ship, I believe. About 30 people, and they were Angolan. They were from West Africa, and some of them were Catholic. And at this time, it was not legal, according to European custom, to enslave a Christian. So a small number of these folks weren't free, but weren't necessarily slaves. And so you have the beginnings of a free population. But make no mistake, many of these folks were also slaves. And so you have the beginning of slavery, and what is eventually going to be a completely race-based system of slavery that is unique in history.
And 1619 is going to go down as the year in which the slaves actually starts.
Right.
But the first Europeans to bring slaves to the New World were in 1553, wasn't it?
They were very early on.
The Spanish did it.
In Florida.
Yeah, they brought them in.
And potentially even an enslaved African who helped explore Texas.
And those, but the ones that we associate with are the ones that came with the English, and that was in 1619.
Right. So you have the Columbian exchange going on, and what you have is something, this is called the triangle trade. So you have slaves from West Africa brought over the dreaded Middle Passage. The Middle Passage, when they would capture people and put them in slave fortresses on the African coast, they would then take them in small ships to larger ships waiting at anchor, and they would stack these people on these wide, 6-foot wide shelves. They would lay them down. They called it tight packing. You wanted to pack the ship with as many bodies as you could. And so there'd be a 6-foot wide shelf, and you'd lay somebody on their back, chain them down to that shelf by their ankles and wrists, and then there'd be another shelf right over your head, so maybe spaced out about 14 to 16 inches. And they would stack these people beneath the hold of these ships, and these were just really abysmal, wretched places, and numerous people died. Slave uprisings were extraordinarily common. It was not a matter of if, but when there'd be some sort of uprising on a slave ship, and so harsh punishments were used. Women were preyed upon on these slave ships, and these are men, women, and children that were brought over. So slaves are brought via the infamous Middle Passage to the New World. Products or raw materials are produced. You're going to get gold, silver. You're going to get sugar, rice, indigo, all sorts of tomatoes, potatoes, squash, all sorts of things are going to be produced to go back to Europe. They're going to be turned into finished goods and sold throughout Asia back to the Americas. And so this triangle trade system is going to drive the growth of the modern world. We're going to see industrialization in Europe. We're going to see lots of money and goods and ideas flowing back and forth. And so this is going to be an important engine for modernization. All right, so consequences of colonization. Africans were used as slaves. That's going to have tremendous consequences as we move forward. It's worth noting that the type of slavery that, like I said, that existed here was unique in history. You will occasionally hear people say, well, slavery's always existed. Not the kind of slavery that was practiced in the New World. It was a very unique form of chattel slavery that was exclusively based on race. There was a process they never quite managed to, but they tried to completely dehumanize the slaves by taking their names, by treating them worse than animals, and they economically incentivized. So in Europe, things were patrilineal, passed down by the father. That was problematic with slavery. They made slavery matrilineal. So if your mother was a slave, you were also a slave. And that basically made it profitable for masters to rape their slaves. They could make money off of rape. Think about that for a second. I mentioned that it was illegal to enslave a Christian. Well, the House of Burgesses just said, okay, guess what? Slaves can't convert to Christianity anymore. So that takes care of that. So you got to understand that this is a very unique, especially cruel form of slavery, and it's not going to go away. It's going to grow as an institution. Even after the slave trade is made illegal, the population of enslaved people here is going to be self-sustaining. And by the time we get to 1860, there's going to be 4 million enslaved men, women, and children in the southern United States. We're going to fight a very, very catastrophic war to cut this institution off the body of the nation. This is the beginning of it right here in 1619. American Indians lost their territory. Within a few generations, those millions of people that were here are going to be virtually wiped out. The few that are left are going to be kicked off their ancestral lands. They're going to be given other lands farther west, but that is a temporary arrangement because as these colonists and later Americans expand westward, that process is going to repeat itself. They're going to be pushed off their lands and pushed off their lands, and it's going to be a continual kind of process of persecution and subjugation. It's a very tragic story. So, and we'll expand on that as we go through the course. New agriculture, not just new agricultural products, but ideas, people, culture are flowing across the Atlantic. So you're going to have Europeans coming here and bringing European ideas. Like a really good example is like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, who wrote about things like life, liberty, and property. They're going to bring those ideas to the New World. You're going to get enslaved Africans coming from West Africa to the New World. And an enslaved African named Nat Turner, an enslaved African-American named Gabriel Prosser, are going to hear about life, liberty, and property, and they're going to have slave revolts based on those ideas. So what you're getting is a mix of culture. The food, Native American diets, and African diets are going to influence European diets and change the way Europeans live and work and eat. So there is a massive cultural exchange. Agricultural products, ideas, music is going to flow both ways across the Atlantic. Another good example. So European culture is going to be adopted by enslaved Africans and Native Americans, but Native American and African culture is also going to be adopted by Europeans. When you think of the banjo, what do you think of?
You think of the mountain people.
You think of mountain people, kind of like bluegrass. The banjo is an African instrument. It was called a banza. And the music that we consider bluegrass, kind of country-type music, has its origins in African music. And so, like I said, there's just a really big cultural exchange that's happening. You don't want to look at it as a one-way sort of Europeanizing the world, because it did not happen that way. People are acting on each other and fundamentally changing each other in very dramatic ways. And that concludes. Go ahead, Mr. Anderson.
I was going to say, they didn't show it on this slide, and I can't remember if it's on the next, where they talk about Nathaniel Bacon. Do they talk about Bacon?
We don't. So in this course, we don't really get into Nathaniel Bacon's not in our SOL.
But Bacon's a turning point. Bacon's a turning point because people always ask, when did they switch from indentured servants to slaves? They had slaves and indentured servants in about the same amount of, in the same amount of slaves as there were indentured servants, all the way until you get to Nathaniel Bacon in 1675, 76. And what happens is Nathaniel Bacon is a freedman. He's moved out to the Piedmont. He doesn't feel like he's getting represented in the House of Burgesses. He feels the Indians are attacking in the frontier, the Piedmont frontier, and he starts a rebellion. And in this rebellion, he burns down the city of Jamestown. Governor Berkeley has to leave in a boat.
He's got to hide out on a ship.
He starts working his way up the coast, burning plantations, and finally Nathaniel Bacon gets to Gloucester, and he dies in Gloucester of dysentery. And from that point on, I've associated Gloucester with dysentery. Go figure.
The wealthy elite.
But what happens is this: these owners now start thinking, you know what? It's not profitable. And it's dangerous for me to have indentured servants. After 1676, guess what happens to indentured servants? It pretty much disappears. And then what becomes the rock bed of the the economy, especially in the South,
Right.
is slavery.
The wealthy elite saw the potential danger in indentured servants. They're young. If they work off their contract, they have their freedom. They have guns. They have access to alcohol. They're impulsive, right? And they're angry, and they don't have land. And guess what? Now we have a big, young, armed, landless class of people that have a bone to pick. So what we're going to do is give them a little bit of land, give them just enough, and then use African slaves. This is going to become a power dynamic that is going to dominate, especially in the South. Because what you're going to have are these really, really wealthy landowners. And then you're going to have, and they're a very small percentage of the South. And they're going to be the predominantly the slave farmers. Then you're going to have all these poor whites who just have a little bit. And so you might think, well, why didn't the poor whites and the enslaved, there were 4 million enslaved African Americans by 1860. That's almost half of the southern U.S. population. Why didn't they all just band together and overthrow the elites? Well, basically what would happen is these wealthy elites would give those poor whites just enough. So it'd be like if you had an enslaved African American and a poor white farmer, and then you've got Mr. Wealthy plantation owner, and there's 10 cookies. Right? And Mr. Super Wealthy plantation owner comes up and takes 9 of the cookies, and then he points to the poor white farmer and he says, hey, that enslaved African American right there is trying to take your cookie. And so they would pit them against each other. And that's how the wealthy elite were able to stay in power and stay so wealthy at the expense of both of those groups. And that's why we're going to end up having to fight this thing out.
Mr. Pierce, you didn't pick up that I compared. I said Gloucester always makes me think of dysentery.
Gloucester makes you think of dysentery.
And you're from Gloucester, I thought you'd be hurt from that. But
when you were talking about Canada and the harsh climate and barely livable conditions, I thought of Michigan.
And I thought of home too. I thought, hey, that sounds pretty cozy. All right, I think we're done.
All right.